I'd like to welcome you all here this morning, and also to point out that we've started a tiny bit late because, unfortunately, the person who was running another course close by had quite a serious car accident last night, so some people from that course have now joined this course. I was very shocked to hear about the accident since I know the person very well. She is an art historian, as am I by training, though I'm now one of the Deputy Vice Chancellors. So I just want to say to those of you who, under those unfortunate circumstances, have joined this course, you will definitely not regret being here. You are in the presence of a lecturer who has done a huge amount to popularize science and who is absolutely stellar in the way that she presents things, in the way that she enthuses people through her knowledge. So much so that we have finally managed, after 2 years, to convince her to mount a MOOC. Don't know whether you all know about MOOCs. There are massive open online courses that are free, and one of these is going to be mounted based on this course, Extinctions, Past and Present. Professor sorry. I'm getting... sorry, I just got my thing. Chinsamy-Turan is the past head of the Department of Biological Sciences, and the future, or the new head of Biological Sciences, who's also participating in this course, is in the audience. And they will be putting together this wonderful MOOC based on the course. So your feedback, I think, is also going to be important in this regard. Professor Chinsamy-Turan really doesn't need any introduction. I know many of you have attended courses of hers in the past, but I think it's just amazing to see how stellar she is as a scholar, not only as somebody who enthuses people through her lecturing. She has the most amazing CV. In 1995, she received the NRF President's Award. In 2005, she won the South African Woman of the Year Award. In 2012, she was awarded the NRF Transformation Award, and in 2013, she was awarded the World Academy of Science Sub-Saharan Prize for the popularization of science. She's also served as the director of the Assoc Museum's Natural History Collections, amongst many other things. So with that limited introduction to this stellar person, I'm sure you will all enjoy what you hear today.
Hi, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to see so many of you here. And you know, I may not know all of you by name, but I certainly recognize some familiar faces. So welcome back. It's been a year, and I sometimes think summer school should be more frequent because I think it's such a long wait until the next summer school. So today, as you know, we're going to talk about extinctions, past and present, but our entire course is called Extinctions, Past and Present. In this course today, in this lecture today, I'm going to deal with extinctions in deep time. And we're going to look at these 5 major extinction events that have occurred over the history of life on Earth. So this is what we call the big 5 extinctions. And some of you may know this chart. Oops, let's just get this right. No, sorry. Where's the maybe I'm going to have to just use my own. I'll just have to use my own then, maybe, because there we go. Okay, so some of you may know this chart. It's the history of life chart from my book, Fossils for Africa. And from this chart, you know that life on Earth extends to about 3.5 billion years on Earth. And we know that the earliest life forms are actually microorganismal. And as we go through time and become increasingly to the present, we begin to see more complex forms evolving. So I'm not going to talk about the development of life on Earth, because that's part of another course that I'm doing, but really just to say that if we look at the whole history of life on Earth, we can see that there is different times, different organisms originate. But what is also very clear from the fossil record is that throughout that history of life, there are these 5 major events that affect the current biota of the time. And the red lines that you see there are those 5 extinction events. So what we also know is that at each of those events, depending on what was around at the time, we see the demise of those families of organisms. So as you can imagine, the earliest one, we're going to talk about that in a moment, is the one that mainly affected the marine realm. And as we go through this, I want you to always bear in mind that these extinction events affect the organisms that are present, and sometimes, and more often than not, the most dominant organisms of the time actually go extinct, and we find that new organisms come to dominate. And the new organisms are usually the most inconspicuous ones, the ones that in the fossil record we barely see traces of them. But after the extinction event, they become dominant. And it's the kind of idea that after an extinction event, these organisms, the ones that were not so well adapted to the previous environment, become better adapted to the changed environment, and they basically take over and become dominant animals. So the 5 mass extinction events that we're going to talk about, and these are the big 5, there were sometimes small extinction events in between. There's always a background level of extinction that occurs, but these 5 are the ones that have affected more than 70% of all biota at the time. So these are really very high numbers of animals that have been affected. So you'll see the first one is the one that occurs at the end of the Ordovician, which is about 443 million years ago. The next one is the end Devonian, which occurs about 373 million years. Then we have the end of the Permian, and that I put in green because that is the biggest mass extinction event that has ever occurred. And that is the one that occurred at 252 million years. Then the end of the Triassic is a little bit smaller in scale, but also a big one. And then end of the Cretaceous is the last big extinction event. That is the one that occurred 65 million years ago, and it's the one that everybody knows wiped out the dinosaurs. But we're going to talk a lot more about that. And of course, the one that we're currently in is the 6th extinction. And we have 2 talks later in the series that are going to talk about the Anthropocene and the extinctions that humans are causing. So it's very different, and I'll leave that to my colleagues to actually tell you more about. So, as I mentioned, when we look at these extinction events, we have to understand what was around at the time. So 443 million years ago, we know that in the oceans, life was teeming. There were lots of different organisms in the oceans. And there what you see is a picture of some of the diversity of life that we had, mainly marine organisms, some shelled organisms. We see some trilobites there. I wish this thing was working. Oh, there we go. This pointer is working, but the advancer is not. So trilobites, lots of invertebrates, some algae already around. And we know that there's a diversity of these organisms that were around. And we begin to see the very beginnings of these development of fish, which are called the jawless fish, the agnathans. And on land, we see the very beginning of the colonization of land. And so we have the earliest plants and the earliest arthropods, so insects and spiders begin to go onto land. So these are very, very early stages of life moving onto land. But in the seas, there we had huge numbers of animals. And as you can imagine, the seas then would have been the ones that would have been most affected by the extinction event. So we know that this extinction event that occurred at the end of the Ordovician is actually the one that occurred at the time that the Gondwana is actually moving to the South Pole. So basically, these southern land masses form a single landmass called Gondwana land, and Gondwana actually is moving towards the pole, and by the Silurian we know that Gondwana is actually at the pole. And we think that the extinction event that actually occurred might have been because of widespread glaciation. Certainly there would have been sea level changes, and all these would have resulted in a major change in the environment of the time. So we know from the fossil record and from what's been collected before the event and what's been collected after the event that there were many, many marine organisms that were affected. More than 100 families go extinct at this boundary. We know from the numbers of families that were affected, this was the second largest extinction event. And we also know that many of the trilobites, these trilobites, which were very, very dominant at the time, and there were many different varieties of these trilobites, many of them go extinct, not all of them, some of them do survive, but their numbers are drastically reduced at the end of the Ordovician. The nautiloids also, and these crinoids are also, they're like sea lilies, they also take a serious knock, and many, many families go extinct. But again, as I said, that crisis of the biota leads to the extinction of so many of those organisms that were abundant. But after that extinction event, we begin to see new forms arising. So new organisms become adapted to the changed environment. And what we see then is that the biggest event, which is very important for us actually, is the development of these armored fish. These are fish that develop these huge bony plates along their bodies, and we have in South Africa many examples of them. Here's a fossil of this Grönlandapsis from South Africa, and we have these acanthodians also that develop, and we see the diversity of fish suddenly increasing. So it's a time when these fish begin to dominate the seas. They begin to become increasingly more common. So the next period after that is the Devonian. And in the Devonian, we see the first tetrapods, so the first animals that actually have legs begin to move onto land. So you have the first four-legged animals, that's what tetrapods means. The first four-legged animals begin to make their appearance, and many of them we think were amphibious, so mainly spending time in the water, but possibly also able to move onto land. And there's good evidence from the fossil record about these transitional animals. We also begin to see the rise of vascular plants on land. So we have these early trees that develop, these Archaeopteris. We have wingless insects that actually are becoming more and more abundant on land. And we see that the abundant life in the seas that was already there, we see more diversification of the trilobites and the brachiopods, the echinoderms, and the ammonites. So the crisis happened, but there were changes, new forms originate, new forms begin to dominate, and we see again life has this resilience and bounces back with new biota. And what we know then is that the next time there is an extinction event, a different crop of animals are affected. And we see that during the Devonian, these groups that I mentioned become established, but by the end of the Devonian, we see that these extinction events that occur really, again, takes main effect on the marine environment. We see these large armored fish go extinct, the placoderms. Again, the trilobites are affected, and of all the diverse array of brachiopods that were around, only 15% of them survive. So when you look at the fossils that are collected, you can actually see the diversity before and after the event. And that's how we can work out 15%, because we can clearly see how many make it across that boundary. And there's also been a suggestion that there may have been changes that were occurring, and there may have been other smaller events, and the big one was really just a marker that really culminated in all these other extinctions. So sometimes, because this happened such a long time ago, this is 373 million years, and if there's no actual trace of the event and how it occurred, it's very difficult to understand what caused it. So later on, when we talk about the end of the Cretaceous, we'll see that there is evidence for a series of things that were happening. But at the Devonian, we're not exactly sure exactly what was the reason for this. But again, after this extinction event, we see a different group of organisms diversify. We see the ray fin fishes, the cartilaginous fishes, which are things to which the sharks and rays and skates belong, they diversify. And we see the tetrapods become increasingly more common, and they undergo a very important diversification at that point. So if we look at this chart about vertebrates, these are animals with an internal skeleton, so they are vertebrates. And so we are vertebrates as well. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that the vertebrate radiation goes way back to about 500 million years. And really, it begins in the oceans. But we see that by the time we have the amphibians, we see that life moves onto land. And these other extinction events, when they occurred, they affected these basal vertebrates. So they affected those placoderms I told you about, and they affected the agnathans, the jawless fishes. So the very early extinctions would have affected just these groups. But as we look at these vertebrate radiations, we know that these tetrapods evolved here, but we begin to see more complex development of animals, like the reptiles develop. From the reptiles, we will get birds, we will get dinosaurs, and the whole diversity of modern reptiles also. And from this reptilian group, we also see the radiation of mammals. So as you can imagine, these different extinction events then become increasingly more dominant. These extinction events affect many more vertebrates and more complex vertebrates also. So if we move on from here, we see that the next extinction event, which is called the end of the Permian extinction event, by this time, we know that the mammal-like reptiles had diversified to a very, very large extent. And we know that if you look at the fossil record, we know that there were many, many different kinds. I'm sure some of you know that the Karoo Basin was teeming with these mammal-like reptiles. They're called the therapsids. In fact, I have this book. I don't know if any of you saw this. This is called The Forerunners of Mammals. It's more an academic book, but if you are interested, it really is about the diversification of these early mammals. And we know that there were many different kinds of these early mammals. They're not even mammals, they're called mammal-like reptiles. So they're not mammals, but from them, and from particularly this group called the cynodonts, we see mammals radiate. But all of them together are known as the mammal-like reptiles. And we know that in the Permian, and South Africa has the world's most fabulous deposits to look at the mammal-like reptile radiation. So if you visit the Ezeco Museums of Cape Town, and if you go to their display on the fossil stories, you'll see many, many examples of these mammal-like reptiles. And we know that they belong to these different clades, and there are many different kinds. So this particular group was mainly plant eaters. They have very wonderful specialization for plant eating. And these two were carnivores, and this particular group was a mix of both herbivores and carnivores. But very, very unusual, diverse life forms. And then this big extinction event occurs. At the end of the Permian, we see this really catastrophic extinction event that leads to the demise of majority of these organisms. It is so stark, you can actually go into the museum and you can look at the Permian collections and look at the Triassic collections, and you can see the way in which the numbers have changed. It's a complete turnover in what was dominant before and what is dominant after. And I mean, this graph, I think, shows it quite clearly. So the important thing to note here is that the group that gave rise to the mammals eventually, not just yet, is the cynodonts. And if you look at where cynodonts actually are found, we see the earliest cynodonts are found right before the end of the Permian. And compared to all those other mammal-like reptiles, their numbers were very, very sparse. And yet we see after the end of the Permian, those cynodonts become the dominant animals. And we're going to look at that more closely. Okay, that is just where it occurs and the time. If you go into the Karoo Basin here in South Africa, you'll see that there's very distinctive change in just the coloration of the deposits. So here in Batuli, that arrow points to the end of the Permian, so the Permian-Triassic boundary. I mean, anybody can see there's a very distinctive change in just the color of the deposits that are Permian and the color of the deposits that are Triassic. And that is a very distinctive marker, and we have people here in South Africa, particularly Roger Smith, who has worked on the end of the Permian extinction event and the recovery thereafter. So it's very clear, even in the sediments, that there was some major catastrophic event that occurred. So we know that from the fossil record again, we know that 90% of all marine species go extinct. I mean, that's a phenomenal number. And 70% of terrestrial vertebrates take a serious knock. And often people say this huge extinction event, the end of the Permian, is what really brought life to its knees. So they were very, very, life almost went extinct. But some groups did survive. And we see that on land, the radiation of those mammalian ancestors, the cynodonts I told you about, their radiation really was spurred on after the end of the Permian. And as you can imagine, there's been many people trying to understand what was it about those cynodonts that made them successful, whereas all their other relatives all go extinct. And a huge number of researchers are working on that area. We know that in terms of the plants, we can see very distinct changes in the plants that were around at the time. Before the extinction event, all over the world, there were forests of these Glossopteris plants. So these are Glossopteris. They became big, giant trees. They had long, strappy leaves. I haven't shown you pictures because I'm sure Mutama is going to show you pictures tomorrow. He's going to talk about extinctions of plants over time. So these are these long plants which have trees that develop these long strap leaves. They have very interesting ways in which they reproduce. And we see that they take a serious knock and they make way for this group of plants called the Dichoridium. And the Dichoridium flora become the dominant flora of the time. So even because there were such big changes in the ecosystems, different groups now become dominant. And we see this both in the plants as well as in the animals of the time. And later, in the Triassic, so we see the cynodonts becoming dominant, these numbers, the dicynodons, they basically dwindle and eventually they go extinct in the kind of just past the middle of the Triassic. These pterocephalians, they survive, one or two lineages survive, and they go extinct. These other groups go extinct completely. I currently have a student who's working on this group, and they really are a very unusual group, but they go extinct even before the end of the Permian. So they were already outcompeted by these other successful mammal-like reptiles. So we see these cynodons continue, and from these cynodons, we see the mammals actually radiate. So that is certainly an important radiation for us. So because the end of the Permian is such a big event, there have been a number of researchers working on what caused the extinction event. So some people have suggested it may have been the merging of the continents to form Pangaea, so to form one single continental landmass. There may have been, again, extreme volcanism that resulted in instability of environments. And there's even been a suggestion that there may have been an impact, a meteorite impact in eastern Antarctica. And NASA has found that under 1.6 kilometers of ice, there is a crater that has a diameter of about 480 kilometers. So a very huge crater. But again, we're looking at something that occurred 252 million years, and lots of things have changed, and it's very difficult to say with certainty that it's one or the other. So very complex. But these are possible suggestions of what could have caused it. So we know that at the end of the Triassic, there was another extinction event. Not as big as the end of the Permian, but still big enough to be considered one of the big 5 extinction events. And this extinction event occurred about 208 million years ago. And this time, if we look at that cladogram I showed you showing the relationships of the vertebrates, we know by then amphibians were around, reptiles, and many of those therapsids, like the cynodons that survived, they actually are affected. And we also see the archosaurs, which give rise to dinosaurs, crocodiles, and flying reptiles, are also affected. So the early radiation. So the end of the Permian, we see the extinction of a number of these mammal-like reptiles. We begin to see the radiation of new groups, and among them are these archosaurs. But they radiate, and then there's another extinction event 208 million years ago. And again, there's a change in the organisms that survive. So after this end of the Triassic extinction, we see dinosaurs begin to become dominant. The radiation of dinosaurs takes place, and we see these huge number of marine reptiles begin to diversify. So you have these plesiosaurs, you have the ichthyosaurs, you have mosasaurs, a huge diversity of marine reptiles, which incidentally none exist today. Except people say the Loch Ness might be one of these plesiosaurs, but there's no proof of that, okay? But this is where they radiate, these big, giant marine reptiles. And I shouldn't say giant, because some of them, not all of them were big. Some of them were enormous, but some of them were fairly small, like dolphin size or even smaller. But there were others that were huge, you know, like 16 meters in size, absolutely massive, massive predators in the ocean. And some of them had these enormous necks. The plesiosaurs are characterized by these long necks that they had, and pedal-shaped flippers, very, very well adapted for marine life. But they go extinct later, as you will see at the end of the Cretaceous. So they have a time that they were dominant, the seas were very different, the organisms in the seas were very different. And we know that after this end of the Triassic event, from the same archosaurs, we see that the pterosaurs, these flying reptiles, develop. So they are not dinosaurs and they're not birds. They are actually reptiles that develop the ability to fly. They were the first vertebrates to fly. And we see that they diversified after this extinction event. And then later, about 150 million years, we see that birds originate. So the origin of birds only occurs after that big extinction event. So if we look at this chart and we look at these life on Earth and how things are developing, we know that the earliest reptiles, the amniotes, diversify in the Carboniferous. So very long ago, about 300 million years ago, we see that diversification. Then we see the development of this group. So reptiles radiate into these different lineages. They actually very clearly 4 different lineages of reptiles. They are these groups, these anapsids, which are the ones that give rise to turtles eventually. So if you follow this orange line, these anapsid reptiles, they give rise to turtles, and we know that turtles evolved so long ago and they still are around today. So the testudines, tortoises, and turtles. We know that these reptiles, again, they also gave rise to another group called the synapsids, and these synapsids give rise to the mammal-like reptiles, and we know they give rise to cynodonts, and these give rise to mammals. All mammals actually arise from that particular lineage, that particular group. So we are mammals, so we also belong to this clade called the synapsids. If we look at this group called the diapsids, they characterize by particular morphology of their skulls. They have 2 pairs of temporal openings, and we see that this group is interesting because they give rise to the archosaurs. The archosaurs are a very big group. They give rise to crocodiles, they give rise to the flying reptiles, and to dinosaurs. So very important radiation of the reptiles. The diapsids also give rise to a whole group of euryapsids, a different clade of reptiles that live in the ocean. So the marine reptiles belong to this group. And we see that the diapsids also give rise to all the lizards and snakes that we know today, the lepidosaurs. So, very interesting for you to know that if we think about the reptilian radiation, it is such an important radiation because all these animals we see today, lizards and snakes, birds, crocodiles, tortoises, turtles, mammals, all of them have their origins from this group of reptiles. And interestingly enough, we can see that this red line here, the end of the Permian extinction event, we can see what it cut across, so which groups are affected. And very importantly, we can see that when that extinction event occurred, how the diversification of these lineages occurred. So the end of the Permian extinction gives rise and spurs on the diversification of all these archosaurs. I mean, a phenomenal radiation, because until this time, there was no animal that was flying. We have the pterosaurs 200 million years ago begin to take to the air. And we see birds evolve much later. This particular one here is the end of the Triassic, and the end of the Triassic is an important extinction event, but it's not one that completely wipes out these lineages. We see some changes in the lineages about which animals become dominant, but it's not a big enough change in the environment to wipe out all of them. So we still see many of them continue, and many of them actually are affected at this point. Look at that. You can see some of these lineages, how they go forward and they go extinct at this point. Here we'll see that all dinosaurs go extinct except for birds. So birds are the group of dinosaurs that actually survive. The only dinosaurs that survive are birds. And we know that there are many other groups that actually go extinct but we see many of them still survive, and we have our modern diversity affected mainly by that end of the Cretaceous extinction event. If you look at this chart, it shows you the diversity of dinosaurs. I mean, in the previous chart, we said the dinosaurs radiate in the Triassic. But if you look at the diversification, we can appreciate that there were so many different kinds of dinosaurs, many, many different kinds. And yet, all of them, they diversify in the Triassic. This is what happens. They begin to diversify, and we see they become increasingly more diverse, and they radiate, and we see by the time we're in the Cretaceous, they're at the height of their diversity. And then we have the end of the Cretaceous extinction event, and every single one of those lineages, except for this group that give rise to birds, the Maniraptora, except for this lineage, all other dinosaurs go extinct. So it's really quite significant to see it as a picture. Imagine if we had all the skulls here and you'd be able to see them. You'd say, what on earth happened? It must have been a phenomenal event at the end of the Cretaceous. But what actually happened? I mean, we really, really do not know with certainty. We have many ideas, but we know that it affected many, many organisms. So we know this extinction event occurred at this point, at the end of the Cretaceous, 65 million years ago. And we know that all these archosaurs, remember the archosaurs radiated to form dinosaurs, and from dinosaurs you got birds. We know that all these other dinosaurs go extinct. And remember, the mammal-like reptiles gave rise to the cynodonts, and the cynodonts, all the time they actually were around. The cynodonts give rise to mammals. And people, if you don't know, I'll tell you that mammals were around throughout the entire history of dinosaurs. So throughout that big radiation of dinosaurs, mammals were small, just about the size of a small rodent, and at the very most, towards the end of the Cretaceous, they were about the size of a small house cat. That was the size and diversity of body form among the mammals throughout the entire range of the dinosaurs. So all this time, we know that the earliest mammals evolved like about 200 million years, just before that big extinction event. They continue all along this period, and then we know that when this extinction event happened, look what happens to the mammals. They diversify. The mammals actually take over from the dinosaurs. So the end of the Cretaceous extinction event sees the extinction of the most dominant land animals, the dinosaurs, and afterwards we see that the diversification of mammals occurs. Those giant marine reptiles in the oceans, they go extinct. In the air, we know these pterosaurs, they have wings that were membranous. We see that they go extinct as well. And many of the birds that radiated during the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, there's a huge diversification that occurs at that time. Many of them go extinct. And if we look at the molecular data, the DNA studies of modern birds, we can trace them to the Cretaceous, but they are very poor fossils of those Cretaceous birds. So if we again think about this, the ones that are successful or became successful afterwards, they were not the dominant animals. They were the ones that were not so well adapted to the environment before the extinction event. So what could have caused this extinction event? Oh, I put this up here just to tell you that sometimes in the literature you'll see that the end of the Cretaceous extinction event is referred to as the Cretaceous tertiary extinction event, because that's the boundary, or the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, or the KT event. But they all really refer to the same crisis at the end of the Cretaceous, so just different names for the same thing. And for this particular event, like the end of the Permian one, there's lots of research going on, and people generally think that it may have been caused by a combination of these factors. So there may have been an asteroid impact, there may have been extreme volcanism, and we know that there were changes in the sea level because of marine regression at the time. So the evidence for volcanism, we know that there was huge volcanic eruptions that occurred in west central India, and there are Deccan Traps, these huge larval deposits that cover more than 500,000 squared kilometers. In some places, there are mountains of these larval deposits. In parts of India, you will see these huge mountains of larval deposits, and people actually have, because these volcanic deposits are very soft, people have carved into them and made temples into those faces of those mountains. And we see that huge, thick deposits occur, and they are some of the largest volcanic features evident on Earth. The other interesting thing about them is that they can be dated quite accurately, and it looks like they have occurred periodically. So it wasn't continuous eruptions, but periodic, episodic volcanic eruptions between 63 to 69 million years ago. So these, clearly the dates for these are quite certain. We know that they may also have been an asteroid impact, and in fact, when we look at the KT boundary around the world, there are many sites. Some of them are terrestrial, some of them are in the marine, under the oceans. This particular one is in Denmark, and I had the good fortune of visiting the site, and it's, as you can see, very close to the ocean, and you have to go there at low tide. But this point right here where this person is looking or pointing or showing, doing something over there, I hope he wasn't taking a sample because he's not supposed to. But at that particular boundary is the KT boundary. And as we saw with the end of the Permian, there is something distinctive about that boundary. And in this case, the boundary has a very distinctive thin layer, and you can see it with your naked eye right where you're sitting here, that boundary where the guy is pointing is a dark layer. And that dark layer is just about a centimeter, maybe a centimeter and a half thick, and it comprises of a clay. And what is interesting is that clay, that boundary layer of clay at the KT boundary has a high concentration of iridium. And iridium is an element that is very rare on Earth, but it's found in abundance in meteorites and other extraterrestrial objects. So it suggests, or it also can come from very deep in the surface, under the surface of the Earth. So iridium is not commonly found on the surface of the Earth, but it can be found from deep and also from other extraterrestrial bodies. So what was, when people examined the KT boundary, and more than 103 localities around the world show a spike in the iridium concentration at the end of the Cretaceous. And when this was first observed, the team that observed it was a father and son team. It was Luis and Walter Alvarez, and they suggested that this clay and the iridium inside must have come from outer space. But at the time, in the 1980s, there wasn't a crater that was observed. And so they said, it looks like it comes from outer space, but we haven't got a crater. We don't actually know how this could have formed. But it certainly was suggestive of it. Oh, what happened there again? It does something strange every now and again. At least must be my fingers on this. I'll fix it. Here's a slideshow from current slide. Okay. And then the crater, the Chicxulub crater, was discovered. And the Chicxulub crater has a diameter of 180 kilometers. And so it's a very huge crater. Within the crater, the iridium anomaly is also present, so this increase in iridium is present. And there are also these glass spherules called tektites that are present. And at the same time, there seems to be at least 3 other craters that are known that occurred, that suggest impacts on Earth around the same time. And this is the Ukraine crater, the North Sea crater, and the Shiva crater in India. So it seems that the end of the Cretaceous may have been a time of really massive changes in environments. And what exactly was the cause of this? We can't say it was definitely the impacts or it was definitely the volcanism, but it seems that all these events together may have caused some kind of disruption in the environments of the time. Sorry, the shock quartz at the impact crater also suggests huge pressure that changes the crystal structure of quartz. So, to summarize, if we look again at these 5 major extinction events, the point that you should all know, don't worry about trying to read this because we've been through all of these different stages, but the point is that if we look at these 5 different events at different times throughout the history of life, we know that at each of them, there were a range of different organisms that went extinct. But what I want you to also always know is that at different times, different organisms then become dominant. We see the rise of different groups, and you can read this, it's in the book actually, but there are different organisms that arise. And we've looked at each of this in detail in the lecture. And the point is that these mass extinction events occurred over this time, and at each of these boundaries, they changed how the next period will look, because the biota was changed. So they spur on changes in the biota that survives, and the ones that survive are probably the ones that become better adapted to the changed environment. So natural selection is able to take place, and we see the development of organisms that are better suited to those changed environments. So the mass extinction events are catastrophic, usually for the dominant species, because the dominant species suggest they are the best adapted at that particular time. But when the environments change, the opportunity arises for new organisms to come about and for new organisms to become dominant and to radiate. And so if we think about mass extinctions as catastrophic for life, we can also think about mass extinctions as having changed the course of the way in which life evolves. If you think further, you'll realize that if the dinosaurs didn't go extinct, mammals would never have radiated. And if mammals didn't radiate, we wouldn't be sitting in this room today. Okay, on that note, people, I'd like to stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. Yes?
There's the KT boundary in the Würzburg Mountains. Have you been there?
No. Is it?
It's outside Prof Anusuya.
Okay. No, I haven't. Really? The KT? Maybe Permian.
Geology. No, okay.
Is there a KT boundary near Graaf-Reinet? I don't think so.
In the Würzburg, definitely. We have a geology group and we go.
John, do you know? No, it doesn't sound right because the Graaf-Reinet is within the Karoo Basin, so it's not the right time period. And in South Africa, there is sites offshore, but not within a terrestrial environment that is KT. Probably end of the Permian, the PT boundary. PT boundary, Permian Triassic boundary. That is certainly possible. Yes?
Could you tell me why did when all the dinosaurs went extinct,
Yes.
why did the mammals survive?
That's $1 million question. But I will try to answer that for you, and I have my own theory about this. So remember I told you that mammals radiated very early on, from about 200 million years, mammals radiated, and they basically were around throughout the time, the 160 million years the dinosaurs were around. So for all this time, mammals and these dinosaurs radiated. The most dominant mammal of the time was something called multituberculate. Now, today, you know, we have monotremes, the egg-laying mammals. We have placentals, which are all of us and all animals that have the young within the uterus. And we have the marsupials. But in the radiation of mammals, even in the Cretaceous, we had these three groups that we have today, but the dominant group of mammals were the multituberculates. Okay, they were the dominant ones. There are hardly any of these others that are around, but there are fossils of them. There are fossils of them. So what we actually think is that these multituberculates were the most well adapted to that environment in the Cretaceous. And like the dinosaurs, something in the environment changed, where they themselves couldn't cope with the environmental change. And when we look at the bone structure, so if you look at the microscopic structure of the bones, I think some of you know that this is my area of research, that these multituberculates show very clearly different kinds of bone structure, which suggests that they were growing very rapidly, very quickly, whereas the monotremes, the marsupials, and the mammals were all growing with what we call flexible growth trajectories. They were able to grow like the way modern crocodiles do. They're able to grow fast when conditions are good and grow slow when the conditions are unfavorable. And maybe this flexibility in their growth is what allowed them to survive into the next period. So when the conditions were unfavorable, all these others that were very well adapted to the current environments, they couldn't cope. It was changes happened so fast that they were not able to cope. And these other mammals that had these flexible growth strategies, they were able to adapt and diversify afterwards. And when we look at the dinosaurs, even those birds, these early birds, we know that many of the early birds were growing differently to the birds that we see today. So, I mean, I've published on that area because, you know, my research involves looking at the radiation from dinosaurs to birds, that transition. And we know that the early birds from the Mesozoic were different in terms of how they grew. And that may reflect changes in their physiology as well.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Yes?
Did it
Sorry.
involve extreme changes of temperature?
There must have been. We think there must have been changes in the temperature. Between the Permian and the Triassic, there were certainly changes. We know that there was aridification in the landscape. We see a number of suggestions in the sediments that suggest there was a drought, serious drought. We see a large concentration of animals in what we think are like waterhole deposits. If you go to the museum, you'll see there's a fabulous fossil display of a Lystrosaurus with more than 14 individuals in a tiny space, like about maybe 1.5 meters. And it looks like they gathered around a waterhole and probably died there. And many similar examples of animals congregating around waterholes. And it looks like there was a very big dry out towards the end of the Permian. Even the Triassic, we think the animals that radiated and became dominant in the Triassic must have been animals that were able to cope with these huge dry out that was occurring at the time. So there must have been changes in the temperature. And that's why we think that the physiological changes of the organisms themselves might have been very important. Some of you may know that we have, in our biological sciences department, we have people working on what we call the hot bird projects. Do you know about that? No? So these are modern birds, and some birds that live in the Kalahari, for example, are able to live in those environments because they have special adaptation, physiological adaptations that allow them to cope with those high temperatures. And so in a changed world, we know that there will be some organisms that will be better adapted to change environments than others. And that's what's wonderful about life on Earth, I think. That even when we know today that we are changing our world so much, and we are the dominant animals, but we know that what comes afterwards may not be humans, okay? More likely than not, it'll be something else. Okay, yes?
Give me your thoughts on de-extinction.
Yeah.
Current
Extinct.
animals that are going to go extinct.
Yeah.
And the future scientific probability of resurrection
Yes.
of animals like mammoth or dodo, and the ethical, moral, and ecological issues that come up.
Exactly. So my feeling is that we shouldn't do that kind of research, or we shouldn't actually try to reconstruct the dinosaur or to reconstruct the mammoth, because in effect we're not actually recreating an animal that is adapted to the world today. I believe that what we should do is spend more time in conserving the biota that we have. So we should try to prevent extinctions of modern animals rather than try to create the extinct animals to recreate. So I personally, for me, I feel that ethically it's not the right thing to do. But there are scientists who are doing it, and I don't actually support that.
The mammoth, though, which you could put into Siberia, you would not change anything from a human standpoint or from the animal standpoint or the ecological standpoint. So the mammoth could exist very, very much like it did before it died.
Yeah, but I don't think we should be trying to play God in that sense. I think that what we should try to do is there are lots of other issues in the world today that we can focus our attention on. And I feel that instead of putting the money and energy into trying to develop and recreate mammoths, I think we should try and use that money to protect the animals that exist. So that is really how I feel about that. Okay, thank you.
Would the atmospheric structure have changed during these various extinction periods?
There are some suggestions that there have been changes, but again, it's very difficult to say conclusively that it has happened. There are people who've done research on air bubbles trapped in ice to try and work out what the environment is, but some people think that it couldn't be a reflection of what the environment all over Earth is. So it's very, very difficult to say exactly what it could be. Yes?
Is somebody going to tell us about what happened to the invertebrates? Do they completely reflect what happened there, or do they completely different plan or physiology?
So with the invertebrates, in fact, we don't have someone specifically talking about it. It will be part of another lecture, but not specifically on invertebrates. But we do see changes in the development of insects. Of course, insects, as you know, are not warm-blooded. They are ectotherms. So we do see changes in their development. But most of the time, the changes that we see in the insects seem to parallel the changes that we see in the plants. And we see that in terms of the evolution that occurs in the insect radiation, they parallel the evolution of the floral radiations. So when you have the angiosperm radiation in the Cretaceous, which I think Mutama is going to tell you about, yes, Mutama will tell you about, angiosperm radiation in the Cretaceous, you see this big diversification of the pollinators that occurs. So insects themselves, we see some extinction events that occurs, and we know that at various times the large size, you asked the question about the oxygen in the atmosphere. In the insects, we know in the Carboniferous and the Silurian, we see big giant insects, and we think it may have to do with the increase in oxygen availability at the time. So we see changes like that, but most of the time among the insects, we see the radiation begins very early, and they continue very much the same, but changes just in body sizes, and then, of course, parallel changes to adaptations to the current flora. Actually, in my book, there's a whole chapter on insects, so if you want to get the Fossils for Africa book. Okay. Oh, there's more questions. Okay, yes, one there and one here. Yes.
Between some of the periods, temperature changes influence the pattern. And if you look at today, there's also the environmental changes. But now today it's due to human contribution.
Yes.
But how can we, I know what it is, the environment changes, but that time, is it inevitable? Do you know what I mean? Is it inevitable because there, no one contributed to the
Yes.
changes, now we contribute. Is this inevitable? Is it irreversible? What's going to happen now?
So that's a very interesting question, and I think it's something that you will certainly deal with in the lectures. Lindsay Gillson will talk about this, mitigating the sixth extinction. It's how to prevent the changes that are currently happening, because if we think about these extinction events that have occurred through time, it is quite possible there will be another natural catastrophic event that can occur. There'll be an asteroid that crashes into Earth, or there could be increased volcanism or earthquakes or whatever. That could happen. But the difference to what's happening right now is that humans are changing the environment in so much of rapidity. So quickly we're changing environments that animals don't have even the chance to adapt. And environments are not just changing, they are being completely destroyed. So organisms are not even able to adapt to something that's changed, because it's now becoming an environment where humans can live. So, constructions of building, changing the way in which the landscape actually is something that is quite serious for life on Earth, because organisms, and we know that evolution can occur, natural selection, which is the mechanism for evolution, can occur. But you need time for an organism to adapt to a changed environment. And in most cases, we are not giving organisms enough time to change. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, people. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow.